A man spent over 1,000 days in a Chinese prison. Now he's warning his own government about the same country trying to sell them cars. And the American president is threatening to blow up a $1 trillion trade relationship over a deal that was never even signed. What is actually going on here, and why does July change everything? If you've been following this story through headlines, you've been getting the surface. Stay with me because the real story is buried 3 layers down, and by the end of this, you'll understand something most analysts are still missing. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Canada should stand its ground or fall in line with Washington? I want to know where you stand before we go any further. Here is how this began. On a Saturday in late January, Donald Trump posted on social media accusing Canada of planning to become a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the United States. He threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports if Ottawa pursued any kind of free trade agreement with Beijing. He called it one of the worst deals of any kind in history. There was one problem. No such deal existed. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, responded within hours. Speaking to reporters in Vancouver, he stated clearly that Canada was not pursuing any free trade agreement with China, and that Washington does not get to dictate the terms of continental trade relationships. Two world leaders, two contradictory statements, one trade war building in real time over a deal that nobody signed. But here's what the headlines won't tell you. This fight was never actually about a trade agreement. This is about Chinese electric vehicles already inside Canada, a border that stretches 5,500 miles, and Washington's fear that Beijing has found a backdoor into the American market. And that fear is not irrational. Think about what a modern Chinese electric vehicle actually is. It is not just a car. It is a data collection system on wheels. Sensors, cameras, GPS, constant wireless connectivity, all of it linked to manufacturers based in mainland China. The Biden administration spent 2 years building walls against these vehicles entering America, citing national security concerns about data flowing back to Beijing from cars driving past military bases, government facilities, and critical infrastructure. Trump inherited those walls and reinforced them. Now his administration is watching Canada, which has not banned Chinese EVs, and seeing an open window. Here is a number that should stop you cold. BYD's Seagull, China's most popular electric vehicle, retails for under $12,000. The cheapest American-made EV starts at roughly $38,000. That is not a price gap, that is a canyon. And it is the reason Chinese automakers are targeting Canada specifically, because American and European doors have already closed. Every BYD sold in Toronto, every Chinese EV charging in Vancouver represents what Washington sees as a potential path across the border into Detroit or Buffalo. This is the vulnerability Trump is threatening to exploit, and this is what the 100% tariff ultimatum is really about. Now here is where the story gets darker. The man warning most loudly about Chinese EVs entering Canada is not a politician or an economist. He is Michael Kubrick, a former Canadian diplomat who spent over 1,000 days in Chinese detention, arrested in apparent retaliation after Canada detained Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on an American extradition warrant. He was held for nearly 3 years. He lost those years. And now, speaking to Canadian media, he is warning his own government that allowing Chinese automakers into the Canadian market gives Beijing another pressure point over Ottawa. When a man who survived 1,000 days in a Chinese prison tells you not to trust Beijing's intentions, that is not an opinion. That is testimony. Keep that thought in mind because it collides directly with what comes next. The Canadian auto industry says that restricting Chinese components from Canadian supply chains could cost 43,000 jobs within 2 years. Ontario's manufacturing corridor from Windsor to Oshawa relies on Asian-sourced parts, including Chinese components, for vehicles assembled right now, today. Domestic alternatives do not exist at comparable price points. Cut off Chinese supply chains, and you raise production costs immediately, making Canadian-built vehicles less competitive in both domestic and export markets. So here is the impossible position Mark Carney is standing in. A man imprisoned by China says open the door and you hand Beijing a weapon. The auto industry says close the door and you destroy 43,000 Canadian livelihoods. Both warnings are correct. Neither is compatible with the other. And July is when Carney has to choose. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, comes up for formal review this July. That review was built into the original agreement, scheduled every 6 years to ensure the framework stayed current. Nobody who negotiated USMCA in 2020 was thinking about Chinese electric vehicles. They were focused on dairy access, labor standards, and dispute resolution. But the world moved fast. Chinese EV production went from 1.3 million vehicles in 2020 to over 9 million in 2025. That is not growth. That is a transformation of the global automotive order at a scale not seen since the assembly line was invented. And now, Trump's team wants to use the July review to force something that was never part of the original deal. A requirement that Canada and Mexico match American restrictions on Chinese goods as a condition for keeping duty-free access to U.S. markets. That would effectively extend American trade policy across an entire continent, whether Ottawa agrees with it or not. Are you starting to see what July actually means? This is a question nobody in mainstream coverage is asking clearly enough. Hit the like button if this is making the picture clearer. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC in early April that the administration expects significant modifications to USMCA during the review, with Chinese trans-shipment through Canada and Mexico listed as a priority concern. The message to Ottawa was precise: restrict Chinese access to your market or face consequences when negotiations begin. Carney's response has been to walk a razor's edge. He has ruled out any comprehensive free trade agreement with China while insisting Canada retains the right to set its own trade policy within its treaty obligations. He points to existing USMCA provisions on country of origin and trans-shipment rules, arguing they already address American concerns. Trump's team is not interested in legal interpretations. They want explicit public commitments, and they are willing to threaten the entire USMCA framework to get them. Here is the layer beneath all of this, the one that connects every piece. This is not fundamentally a trade dispute. It is a question about whether American allies are permitted to have independent foreign policy at all. Canadian vehicle imports represent less than 2% of the American automotive market. Chinese cars are not pouring into Detroit through Toronto. The scale of the actual threat is small, but the principle Trump is enforcing is not small. What he is demanding from Carney is not a tariff adjustment. He is demanding public alignment, a signal to Beijing and to Washington's other allies that Canada does not deviate from American policy on China. Trade dependency becomes political subordination. Energy dependency becomes strategic leverage. Defense dependency becomes operational control. And now, trade policy dependency becomes foreign policy alignment. Every layer of integration between the United States and Canada leads to the same structural conclusion. Proximity to America requires alignment with Washington's priorities, and independence, while theoretically available, is practically unaffordable. But consider what Trump risks losing in this calculation. If he pushes Carney into a corner where every policy decision requires American approval, he accelerates something he cannot control: the moment when Canadian voters conclude that the cost of alignment exceeds its value. The same pressure is building in South Korea, in Japan, across Europe. Alliance systems do not survive indefinitely when they become indistinguishable from imperial relationships. Trump may win this fight over Chinese electric vehicles. What he loses is harder to quantify, but more consequential: the assumption, held by decades of allies, that American leadership serves common interests rather than just American ones. That assumption, once broken, does not rebuild quickly. Trust is constructed over decades. It is destroyed in a single ultimatum. Here is what we know with certainty. Trump threatened 100% tariffs on Canada over a deal with China that does not exist. Carney ruled out that deal while refusing to accept American direction on trade policy. The USMCA review begins in July, with Chinese restrictions now at the center of negotiations. Chinese EV production has crossed 9 million vehicles annually at price points North American manufacturers cannot match without government intervention. Michael Kovrig, who endured over 1,000 days in Chinese detention, has warned his government against opening the door to Beijing. The Canadian auto industry says closing that door costs 43,000 jobs, and Carney has no option that satisfies both warnings simultaneously. What we do not know is whether July ends in agreement or rupture, whether Canada accepts American terms and formalizes the kind of dependency this story has documented across multiple dimensions, or whether Carney holds his line and finds out what 100% tariffs do to an economy that sends 75% of its exports across a single border. There is no deal, but the absence of a deal is the crisis. Because when one country demands alignment and the other refuses it, the space between that demand and that refusal is not neutral ground. It is a countdown, and the clock is already running. So here is the question I want you to sit with. Can Canada maintain a genuinely independent trade policy while sharing a 5,500-mile border with a country that treats independence as disloyalty? Or has the integration run so deep that the only real negotiation left is how fast Canada moves toward full alignment? Tell me your answer in the comments. And if this analysis gave you something the headlines didn't, share it with someone who's still trying to figure out why July matters more than any single tariff announcement. Like this video if the picture is clearer now than when you started. If you want this level of daily analysis on the stories that are actually reshaping the world, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what comes next. Because this story does not end in July. It only escalates.